Jody's conquering the world with gateway women, and I think that's really fantastic. And I told Laura I have to introduce Jody because I wanted Jody at the first one. There was no way I could afford to fly her from London. But I just want to say that when I started the NotMom in 2012, only because I was in a competition, I had to do a business plan. Yes,
the program was called Bad Girl Ventures. And it was here in Ohio, and there were 10 women competing for a $25,000 prize. And to do it, you had to do a full business plan. And at the last page of the business plan, next to last page or so, had to identify your competition. And I said, well, there's nothing like what I want to do with the NotMom. And it was like, keep Googling. So I Googled and I Googled and I Googled, and I really couldn't find much. I could find, infertility sites all by themselves, but nothing really for I know it's not going to happen. And then I found Jody's. And the more I kept clicking around Jody's site, I was consumed with envy. And I was breaking commandments because I was coveting my neighbor's goods, man. It was not a good day. And, Jody already had thousands of readers. And Jody was all cute with her little, she had a professional picture. I was still using my selfie. It was just, she was everything I wanted it to be. No, it wasn't. In some ways I was correct. Her site wasn't what I hoped the NotMom would be by bringing both ends of the spectrum together, but it was established. It just was genius. And so I listed her as my #1 competitor in my business plan. Fast forward a few years, and I kept watching her online, and she's growing and growing, and I'm struggling and struggling. And in my mind, she had like a staff, and she had an office, and she had everything that one day I wanted. So we finally connected through the magic of the internet, and she asked if we could Skype together, and we did. And we sort of, I think, fell in love with each other through Skype. So I ran into my former business mentor who had helped me with the business plan. By the way, the NotMom came in second, and I got $5,000. Thank you. So I ran into my old business coach, and he said, how are you doing? I said, I'm doing pretty good. The community's still growing, and but I gotta tell you, remember my #1 competitor? She and I are now friends. And he said, oh, you can't do that. He said, what do you mean? You mean you play golf or something like that? And I said, no, I think we're friends. And he said, well, how does that work exactly? I said, men in business are lions in the jungle. I think women understand innately, if I help Jody and gateway women, it doesn't take anything from the NotMom, and vice versa. So with that, Jody Day.
So, yeah, I feel a bit blown away by that introduction. So, thank you. Hello, good afternoon. I'm Jody Day. I'm the British founder of Gateway Women. And Gateway Women is the global friendship and support network for women who are childless, not by choice. And extraordinarily, recently we did a kind of an audit, and apparently I have a social reach of 2 million, which is incredible. And this is a long way from from where it started. And so I guess maybe I'm going to start there, because some of you know about me and know about my work, and actually have really been making me blush today by coming up and telling me, what my book and my work means to you, which I'm, really heartened by. But some of you probably never heard of me at all. So I'm 53 and a half. And I was born to what is, to a teenage mum in the early 60s, at a time when it really wasn't cool to have a kid out of wedlock. So I kind of came along and pretty much sort of spoiled the 60s for my mum, I'm afraid. And so she was, under a lot of pressure to kind of get married and have a respectable home for me. So my mum got married when I was about 3. And I grew up in a pretty unhappy home, also quite a lot of domestic violence in the home as well. So as I was growing up, my idea of, what family life was about was it wasn't actually a great experience. And then also, I was growing up in a time when, things were really, really different for my generation compared to our mother's generation. There were so many opportunities coming up for us. And that was what, was being talked about. That's what my mum was talking about. No one ever talked about, when I grew up and, I would get married and have kids. That just absolutely wasn't really on the agenda. It was all the things that I would have the chance to do other than that. So that's really where my focus was when I was growing up. And, I was aware of gender issues quite young. I mean, I remember I have this book, which was one of my favorite children's books, which was The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. And I found it the other day. I got it out of storage. And if you open the front cover, it says, "An adventure for boys and girls of all ages." And I've crossed out "and boys." So I think I was already getting, pretty peeved about sort of gender issues quite young, because I saw in my childhood experience that your life as a woman was really, really impacted by the way the men around you behaved. So I kind of grew up quite I didn't have a word for it yet, but quite feminist, quite aware of things, and, fiercely independent. I didn't want a man to be making choices for me about my life. So I kind of went out into the world, quite a sort of fierce and political young woman. And my role model was Madonna in Desperately Seeking Susan. So, ripped fishnet tights and all. I was just like, I was not taking any shit from anyone about anything. I still got the cool jacket. And so when actually, in my very serious relationship I was having in my early 20s, I fell pregnant. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified, because the mantra I'd grown up with, that I'd absorbed, was kind of children ruin your life. And, I had an abortion. I was terrified of becoming a mum. I was also terrified of becoming, an unhappy mum, like my mum had been. So I don't regret that abortion, because I think it was the right decision for me and for that child. What I didn't know is I would never be able to conceive again. So, but I always mention abortion as part of my story, because abortion, like ambivalence, is one of the kind of taboos within the taboo of our story. It's one of the things we're sort of not meant to talk about. And for some reason in life, if there's something we're not meant to talk about, that seems to be the stuff I want to talk about. So, abortion, infertility, childless, child-free, menopause, aging, death, the really juicy ones. That's the stuff I'm really interested in. So it's not very British, I think, but I do like to get right stuck in there with the controversial subjects. So I then went on to meet the man who became my then husband. And pretty much, quite early on, when we were getting serious, and certainly when he proposed to me, I said, I'm not sure I want children. And he was like, okay. That was it. That was this really important discussion. We got married, and in time I began to realize that my fear of having children was really about being scared of, my childhood. And I began to understand that, that wasn't necessarily how it was going to be. And that if we were to have children, it would be our child, a combination of, my then husband and myself. And we were very much in love. And so I kind of changed my mind and said, I think I do want kids. And he went, okay. So, I know that these discussions, can really tear relationships apart. And I can't believe how lightly, I discussed it with him, but it was okay, it worked out. So I was 29 at that point, and I started my journey towards trying to have a family. And nothing happened. I was pretty confident that it would happen, because as far as I was concerned, having had a pregnancy and had an abortion, I thought, well, the pipes all work, everything's been tested, but nothing happened. So 4 years into that, I had an operation to check that everything was okay and that there had been no damage. And when I came round from the anaesthetic, the consultant, rather avuncular, very British consultant, said to me, "First-class property. Finest uterus I've seen all week." you lovely young people go off and have lots of sex. That was it. That was the fertility advice. That was all I got, which was extraordinary, you know, because I was 33 by this point, and I was, you know, as I said in the talk this morning, I was really ignorant about fertility. I mean, I knew nothing that, you know, a couple of years later at 35, I would become this kind of statistic that, you know, now, you know, much younger women are very aware of, that 35 is a really serious cutoff point for your eggs aging. I didn't even know my eggs aged. I didn't know anything about it at all. So I left that clinic and went out and just, well, took the advice of the doctor, and really entered a period of what I now call baby mania, which is that I just did everything I could to get pregnant. You know, I gave up this food and I took up that food. You know, I peed on every color of stick you could imagine. You know, I was an expert on ovulation and timings. You know, I left a job that was by a road that was very polluted. You know, I saw really every alternative practitioner, nutritionist, acupuncturist, you name it, I was happy to give them money. I mean, frankly, I could have just walked around London randomly putting £50 notes through people's door. You know, I was really up for it. And the final person I saw actually was a shaman, which I've got nothing against shamans, but it did have a lot to do with eggs, breaking eggs over me and various things like that. But I was very vulnerable. You know, I think anyone who could kind of offer me some hope, I was up for it. And, you know, sometimes I say that I think hope can be one of the most toxic fertility drugs. It can really keep you going and keep you stuck for a very long time. So kind of carry on through my journey, and I get to the point when I'm, you know, moving into my late 30s now, and my then husband sort of says to me, I think we probably should do IVF. And I had such an awareness moment because I was in the bath and he said it, and I just thought, I can't bring a baby into this. You know, it was, sadly, you know, his kind of workaholism had ticked over into alcoholism and into drug addiction. And, you know, so I was on my fertility baby mania journey, and he was dealing with that. And we were in a mess. And I realized, no, I'd grown up in chaos and around substance abuse. I thought, no, I can't do that. So in a way, it was actually a deeply maternal decision to kind of not to go forward at that point. And that was the beginning of the end of my marriage. I got out of my marriage and I started dating on the brand new world of internet dating, which was still very new. I've always been a bit of an early adopter, and I've always been quite sort of techie and quite brave, so I was out there very soon, but goodness, I should not have been out there, you know, because I was, you know, just coming out of a 16-year relationship, and just all I could think about was finding someone else to be with and do IVF and have a family. I thought, I've still got time, you know, I'm 38, 39, I thought, I've still got time. I really didn't understand how difficult it would be. I think I also didn't understand perhaps what a challenge it might be to date me at that point, you know. So carry on, and actually I had 2 significant relationships post-divorce until I found myself at 44 and a half on a Tuesday afternoon in February. The second of my most serious relationships had broken down, and it came to me. I just thought, that's it. You know, I'm never going to be a mum. Because I thought, well, even if I were to meet someone else now, we'd need to know each other for at least a year before we could even think about doing IVF. And I'd be 45 and a half. It's done. You know, it's done. And it was an extraordinary moment in my life that I will never forget, because it was as if there was a movement in my belly. And it was like these 2 channels of energy. You know, one of them was the life that I'd been living in my dreams for the last 15 years, and all the plans that I'd made for motherhood, and all of the things I hadn't done because of those plans. Well, I can't do this job because of the maternity leave, and I don't want to do my master's now because that'll interfere with this, and I can't be with this guy, and I can't make that decision. This, you know, I call it now sort of psychological nesting. You know, I was always making all these plans to create a life that I could bring a family into. And then there was the life I was actually living. You know, the one I was standing in. And I realized that you know, these two sort of paths of my life kind of came together at that point. And it was like I woke up. You know, I woke up from a dream. And at first, I was excited because I went into the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. And I thought, okay, well, when I was 20 and I looked ahead, you know, until I'm 50, I thought maybe I'll live that long, you know, really old, 50. You know, I can do anything with my life. And I thought, well, why can't the years from 45 to 75 be like that? You know, I've got space now. I can do something. And the really shocking thought that came to me, I thought, was when was the last time I had a thought like that? You know, because the dream of motherhood had so consumed me that I'd kind of forgotten how to dream alternative futures. And actually, even if I did have a little bit of a dream, I would push it away in case somehow that nixed my chances of becoming a mum. It's kind of like really sort of magical thinking territory. I really thought I had to be so focused on the goal of motherhood and that any deviation from it would mean that I didn't make it. So for that afternoon, for a few hours, I was feeling quite kind of like, yeah, I can do this. And I can get my mojo back and, you know. And then the following day, it was like I fell off a cliff into a pit. The deepest, darkest pit of distress I can possibly describe. And I didn't know what the hell it was. And it was a long time until I found out what it was. I consulted doctors and therapists, you know, what it is that is happening to me. But nobody was able to name it as grief. And I haven't had a particularly smooth run in life. I've had quite a lot of trauma and difficulty to overcome. And I'd always managed to. But this didn't seem to respond to anything. And it was about 2 years after that February morning, and I'm in a weekend workshop, a training workshop for my psychotherapy masters that I'm doing. And it's about bereavement. And I'm, you know, the tutor is going through the classic model, the 5 stages of grief model. And I'm kind of thinking, this feels really familiar, you know. So I go home that evening and I write down what I've learnt and I map it against my own experience. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm grieving. And I was so relieved for 2 reasons. Number one, I knew I wasn't going mad because I was a bit worried, you know, that I was kind of losing my mind. My personality had changed. I didn't enjoy the things I used to. And none of the things that that would normally help me recover from something seemed to be working. So I thought, okay. And the other thing was, I don't know how, but I know that grief ends. It's a process. People come out the other side of it. So I actually thought, okay, somehow I'm going to come out the other side of it. And I had started writing my blog, Gateway Women. And the reason I'd started my blog was because nobody would let me talk about my pain. You know, I would try to talk to someone about it and they'd say, oh, but I met this woman and she met this guy at the bus stop and, you know, he's on remand and she's in remission and they've got twins and don't give up and why don't you just adopt and all of this stuff. And it would just be impossible to actually talk to people about the fact how hard I was finding coming to terms with childlessness. In fact, a friend of mine said to me, you know, as I started to sort of begin to think that maybe I was going to be okay, she said, I can't have you coming to terms with this. And I was like, what? She said, it's not okay with me that you can come to terms with this. And I said, you know, my childlessness isn't actually catching. But it really felt like this, that somehow, my situation was quite toxic. And so, you know, people really didn't want to hear about it, and everybody wanted to fix it. You know, everybody wanted to offer me a solution. And I knew that the time for solutions was over for me, and actually, for me, the solution was going to be, how am I going to get to the other side of this? How am I going to get Jody back? You know, because if there's anything left, you know, is there any diamond left in the rubble? I wasn't sure. So that was the first really turning point for me, was finding out that I was grieving. And I became a bit of a grief junkie at that point. I read everything I possibly could, and I started writing about it on my new blog. And women from all over the world wrote back to me and were like, me too. How do you know the exact words that are in my head? You know, how can you read my mind? And it was extraordinary. So although I didn't know anyone in my personal life, or anyone amongst my acquaintances or colleagues, or even in the wider culture that was going through this, it seemed there were women all over the world who understood what I was experiencing. I didn't realize that I was breaking a huge taboo by being honest about my pain. You know, that's why people didn't really want to talk about it. But like I said earlier in my introduction, I have a fascination for talking about the things you're not meant to talk about. So I pushed through and I carried on talking about it, and women said to me, can you sort of do something? Because you seem to understand this, like no one else understands it. And because I'd had some time working in 12-step groups, you know, recovering a group called Al-Anon, which really saved my sanity when I was kind of recovering from being around addiction in my marriage and as a kid, I thought, okay, I don't need to be the expert. You know, all I need to do is to create a safe space for women and a structure, and then the healing will happen. You know, the power of peer-to-peer healing, which is really what the rooms are all about in addiction recovery. So that's how the very first kind of Gateway Women group started, and then I started workshops, and then the workshops turned into a book, which I was crowdfunded by Gateway Women from all over the world, the first edition of this book. So here we are, sort of coming up for 8 years later, and, you know, Gateway Women is, well, someone said to me the other day, who does your SEO for you? I said, Google. Because, you know, when you write about a subject for long enough, and you have enough other websites pointing to you, you kind of keep coming up, you know, on the first page. So sometimes I do feel like you know, I'm the most sort of famous childless woman in Britain. So, but I no longer really feel childless, which is a really extraordinary thing to say, because my childlessness was here for many years. It was the first thing I thought about when I woke up in the morning. It felt like it was my whole identity. It was like, hello, my name is Jody and I'm childless. You know, that was how it felt. But through grief, through the extraordinary journey of grief, because grief is a transformational human experience. You know, it takes us from one identity to another identity. It is so misunderstood in our culture. It's also about so much more than crying. You know, it's actually, there's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of transformation, there's a lot of extraordinary things happen in the grieving process when you have company for it. But we live in a very grief-phobic culture. Both the British and American and Canadian cultures are really not very comfortable talking about grief. So in a way, I would say that now that my childlessness is part of who I am. It's not who I am anymore. It's one of the many things that has happened to me in my life that has created the person I am today. So it's almost as if it's like it's kind of behind me. You know, it's part of me. It's no longer front and center. And in many ways, I feel more child-free these days. I mean, I can't claim that term because I understand that it means really making a choice, and mine definitely wasn't a choice. But I feel as at peace with my childlessness now as if I had chosen it. And if someone had said that to me a few years ago, I would have said, no, that's not possible. Nobody can get to that point. But, you know, I've worked with thousands of women, and they are coming out at the other end of their grief, and I know it is possible. I think one of the misunderstandings that kind of broader culture has about us is that there are only two ways to become a woman without children. You know, that you can you either struggle with infertility or you make a choice. And we've been talking a lot about it today, and I think the grey areas in between are just massive. I mean, I wrote a blog, which then became part of my book, and it's called 50 Ways Not to Be a Mother, and I wanted to read a little bit from it here. So number one, being single and not finding a suitable relationship to bring children into. That's just one. Not meeting a partner till we're past our childbearing years. Infertility issues. Being with a partner who doesn't want children or doesn't want more children. We had someone earlier today talking about, you know, genetic issues. there's choice. There are, I wrote 50 because it was journalistically neat, but I could have gone on to write hundreds more. And I think that wider society still has to grasp the variety of choices, rock and a hard place choices and situations that bring us to being women without children. And I think that also applies to our child-free sisters too. I mean, I had this idea at the beginning of my journey that that I was a little bit envious actually of the child-free. I thought, wow, I could have those 15 years of my life, I could have had them back. I could have been happy all of that time with not having children. But then I read Megan Dorm's amazing book, Selfish, Shallow, and Self-Absorbed. And I understood that behind that very clear kind of choice is often a lot of very, very complex stories. And that it's not just a choice that you make once, like a kind of, oh, I'm not going to have kids. That's it. That it's often something that you have to revisit again and again, that is constantly questioned by others. And that it might even involve a partial journey towards parenthood and then a swerve, that there might be grief, there may be miscarriages and abortion and all kinds of loss wrapped into those stories as well, that it's not this kind of happy-go-lucky sort of Disney thing that I kind of, rather ignorantly thought. So I think the idea that, there is the nasty idea about the bingo, which is that child-free women don't like kids and are selfish, and that childless women are a bunch of weeping weirdos. And this is actually a quote. A woman came to one of my talks once and she said, I'm really surprised. Everyone seems quite normal. And I said, well, what were you expecting? And she said, well, I did think it would be a bunch of weeping weirdos. And it's like, what is that about? And the fact is that childless or child-free, we share something in common, which is that we live in a pronatalist society. And it projects onto those of us who don't have children for whatever reason, a deviancy, a weirdness that is not borne out in reality at all. But, just like I was projecting onto child-free women I didn't know, that they hate kids, which, absolutely isn't true. And interestingly, wasn't true of the 2 child-free women I knew. Yet somehow that wasn't enough to counter the weight of pronatalist dogma, that's what child-free women are like. And then childless women, it's very hard for us to meet and come together because we project onto each other those fears that the other childless women are going to be the weeping weirdos. And then women come to my workshops or come to my events and my talks and they look around the room and they're like, actually, they're quite cool, these women. So, what is pronatalism? When I sort of talk about, ideology and pronatalism and things like that, sometimes there's this kind of slightly frightened look in people's eyes. And it's like, well, what is ideology? And I say, well, if you ask a fish, how's the water? The fish will say, what's water? It is the medium in which we live. And it's there right from, the day we're born. And it is the ideology that tells us that the only way to be a fully mature, responsible, and happy, member of society as an adult is to be a parent. And it infuses absolutely everything around us and makes it, makes our identity a very difficult one. And that is something, we have many differences in this room, but that's something we share, is that we live in a pronatalist society. And actually, sometimes if you take out the Latin, the natal, it's like we live in a pro-family society, a pro-baby society. If anything, I'd say that we are living through the most extraordinary period of fetishization of motherhood and family. And I think when you add pronatalism to consumerism, you end up, and the backlash, I think, against, the rise in women and gender equality over our generation, I think we are living through an extraordinary moment. When I was growing up, women being pregnant was a private thing. And I don't know how many of you are old enough in this room to remember the Princess of Wales. And when she was pregnant with her children, she wore this kind of huge, billowing maternity smock. And then if you fast forward to last year when Beyonce was pregnant, and that's in one generation. It's gone from being a very private thing to a very public and a very celebrated thing. And when I was growing up, if our idols and heroines got pregnant, it was really uncool. You didn't, it was quite damaging to a pop star or film star's, reputation to get pregnant. They had to kind of, do it sort of privately and come back with a baby and not be photographed with their baby. I mean, you didn't want to think of Debbie Harry having a baby. She didn't, But, Kate Bush did, and she disappeared. She's recently come back. But it did not add to their cachet, their coolness, to become mothers. It did the opposite. So, it's extraordinary how in one generation our kind of adulation of motherhood, has developed. I think it does a great disservice to mums too, because I think it makes this idea that also that, that motherhood is an amazing experience. The line that they spin is that it's the most meaningful and fulfilling thing you can do. Well, if you spend time around mums, you'll hear that that's not actually true. And certainly child-free women in the room are perhaps, perhaps woke up to that sooner than I did. So I think this idea that, the glorification of motherhood, it doesn't serve the childless, the child-free. I don't think it serves our mum friends either. So an area where we have a lot in common, is around pronatalism, an issue that really affects us, whether we're childless by choice, by circumstance, or any other reason, is in the workplace. Now, in my TED Talk earlier this year, I said that women without children in the workplace is the biggest diversity issue HR hasn't heard of. Yeah. I take it you're agreeing. Yeah, I mean, LGBT has been shown by research to be that 10% of the population would identify in some way with that category. Women without children in the workplace is 20% and rising. So it's double that of possibly the LGBT groups, yet it is completely absent. I mean, no self-respecting HR officer would neglect to include the LGBT point of view in their diversity planning. But where are we and where are our issues? And this is the thing, pronatalism is kind of silencing them. So I think also that the numbers of women without children in the workplace will be rising. We won't know for another few years what the numbers are for those born in the 1970s that remain without children at the end of their childbearing years. But if my inbox is anything to go by, it's going to be really high. And interestingly, I gave an interview to an American podcast show called Jessica Murnane just a few weeks ago. And she told me in the interview that when she had put out on her social media that she was going to be interviewing me, she had the biggest number of kind of, of questions for a potential interviewee that she'd ever had on her show. And her audience is mostly millennials. And that really shows me that they are hungry for kind of real, non-pronatalist conversation about this. They're at the point in their lives when they're really considering whether they can afford to become mothers, whether they want to become mothers. And one of the biggest questions that came up on the show was ambivalence. And ambivalence, like abortion, is another kind of taboo within a taboo. Because pronatalism tells us that real women just know. That there is no kind of questioning. You just know you want to be a mother. And if you know that you don't want to be a mother, there's something wrong with you, of course. But that, you just know. It's a really kind of straightforward thing. And I said, well, our generations, our time in this world is at a time when for the first time ever, it is actually possible to think through the choice to become a parent. There have probably always been women who would rather have not been mothers. But that opportunity hasn't been there. Birth control didn't exist. We don't live in Jane Austen times anymore. You can earn a living, you can survive, without marriage to a man. But the idea is still really difficult for people that, that this is something you need to think through. You need to be allowed to talk about, and they are really hungry for conversation around around the choices, around the issues to do with becoming or not becoming a parent, and why it is that they just don't naturally know. So, women without children in the workplace is a hot button issue. Okay. In 2014, I gave an interview to a British newspaper, and I just mentioned this issue, you know, as part of the conversation I was having. And my comments about the conflict and the issues between mums and women without children in the workplace went viral. Okay, it was just like 2 sentences in this interview. I was on live breakfast TV in Australia, which was an interesting experience. And you know those pictures now when you see interviewees on the telly, and there's Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament behind you. It's not real. You're sitting in a black box at midnight. And it was also picked up by the most prestigious talk radio breakfast show in the UK, which is called the Today programme, which is kind of the one that prime ministers and politicians are on. And they invited me onto the show to talk about this. And what was so interesting is that the female presenter wanted to make out that it was about childless women resenting mothers. It was, do you know what I mean? And I was like, no. This is not about that. This is about fairness. But what was so interesting both on the breakfast TV in Australia and in the British press as well is they wanted to make it into a catfight. They wanted to make it into sort of people being unsupportive towards mothers in the workplace. And I said, no, that's not what it is at all. This is a fairness issue. But it's really interesting because when you try to talk about it, you're seen as unsisterly, as unsupportive to your colleagues who are mums. You know, the line is that as the non-mothers in the workplace, it is our duty to stand behind our sisters who are mum and pick up the slack. And if you do try to say anything about it, then you're bitter. You know, or that's what, if you're childless, you're bitter. Probably if you're child-free, you're a child hater. You know, but it's not that you're actually speaking up for your rights or for fairness. It's made into an emotional issue, and that really silences a lot of women from speaking up about it. So I thought, well, I wonder if anyone else has got any opinions on this. So a few weeks ago, I went onto Twitter and onto Facebook, and I have lots of followers, who are both childless and child-free. And I said, what are your experiences of being a woman without children in the workplace? Oh my God. If I could just say that I collated all of the responses, and they came to 20 pages of closely typed notes, and that was after taking the repetitions out. It was extraordinary how many women responded, and people were emailing me as well and saying, thank you for asking the question, here it is. And it fell into 5 main categories of kind of complications for women without children in the workplace. And I'm just going to cover them briefly, and because I'm really looking forward to the Q&A after to hear what you think. And the first one is really about the dominance of the pronatalist discourse in the workplace. Whether it be, collections for baby showers, whether it be bringing your baby into work, to sort of introduce to your colleagues after you've been on maternity leave, whether it be posters and everything to do with families around the office, whether it is being scan-bushed, as we call it in England, which is when you're perhaps, struggling with the fact that the last time you saw a scan on a screen was your own baby and there was no heartbeat. Someone then puts a picture in your face of their scan. This is just a colleague. It's not even someone you know very well. Or maybe a picture of a newborn or a scan going right round the company email with a welcome to our company family, coming from the head, coming from the HR departments. So there's a really dominance of kind of a family talk in the workplace. And there was a lot of people find that difficult. So the second kind of category was unfair holiday allocations. Any nods in the room for that one? And this is really about the fact that if you don't have children, you are expected to do the crappiest shifts, work weekends and work every holiday, and as one of my respondents said, and without a bleat of protest. You are meant to take this lying down and not to say, actually, I'm sorry, but this isn't fair. This is incredibly common. The third one is around life-work balance. And the idea that life-work balance actually, for women, translates as family-work balance. The idea that the only kind of life outside work for a woman that has any value is bringing up kids. And, this is something, Karen gave, a comment in the Guardian interview, which I totally agree with, which is that companies are conflating, family issues with women's issues. And there are so many of us in the workplace that doesn't apply to, and they really need to wake up to that. The fourth big one is the fact that caring duties are not all about motherhood. Women without children are much more likely to be involved in caring for fragile and vulnerable aging parents. And also, we have partners, we have a life outside work, we have pets, we have emergencies. Things happen that mean that we care for others. And it's about how does that care also get recognized? And the thing is, it usually doesn't. And then the fifth and final one is to do with unfair workload distribution. And I could probably give a whole talk about that one just on its own. One that I didn't really hasn't been part of my experience, but I can really see how it happens, is one respondent talked to me about acting up. So a more senior colleague goes on maternity leave, and part of her responsibilities of her job come to you while she's on maternity leave. But what happens when she comes back from maternity leave is that she doesn't take all of her responsibilities back. And when that happens 2 or 3 times within, to one woman, you end up with a massively increased workload for no recognition, no recompense, and no kind of, the favor doesn't get returned. So this is a really big issue about the workload falling on the childless and child-free women unfairly in the workplace. And once again, if they complain about it, it's seen as unsisterly. And this, some of the issues people told me about were quite scary about, hospital wards being consistently and dangerously understaffed because of companies not being able to handle, maternity leave, and particularly women and men having to leave work for kind of childcare emergencies, and leaving quite important, quite strategic places, seriously and dangerously understaffed. So those are the 5 main areas, and I was staggered by the volume of the information that came towards me, and I asked. So then I asked another question. It's like, well, what would an inclusive workplace look like? Biggest one that came back was sabbatical leave, so. And yet most of us were like, yeah, right, that's going to happen. and I thought, actually, it does sound idealistic, yes. But once upon a time, so did weekends. So did paid holidays. So did maternity leave. It's okay that it's idealistic. And it would be about there being the possibility, if we're going to be living and working for 50, 60, 70 years, we're going to need a few breaks. So I think that's, an inclusive workplace would start looking at sabbatical leave for all employees, rather than, and part of that sabbatical leave might be maternity leave. It would also be a workplace that really gave you protection from pronatalist comments. Now, the thing is that, in our personal lives, we get to choose who we spend time with. And perhaps with the exception of a few particularly hopeless family members, who maybe no matter how many times you explain to them that things are unacceptable, just keep doing it. On the whole, we can protect ourselves from the most upsetting or the most prejudiced comments about being women without children. But we don't get to choose our colleagues. So I think it's really time that we started to make comments about our uterus and whatever it's up to or not up to as unacceptable in the workplace as comments about our vagina. It's really time that family life, which is meant to be a private life, becomes private again. And that those comments are off the agenda, as off the agenda in the workplace as comments about sexuality, about comments about race, comments about disability. And I think an inclusive workplace would develop a recognition that would lead to an elimination of parenthood privilege within the workplace. Because, you know, having a family is a choice. I mean, many of us made that choice and we didn't end up with a family, but it's still a choice for many of us. You know, 7 billion plus people on the planet. We don't need any more. You know, it's absolutely fine not to have children, but to make it a fairer place by taking out that parenthood privilege. Because it's about, we're not going to be able to get rid of it until we can see it. You know, we need to start naming it, and we need to start saying, well, actually, you know, that's not fair. My life outside work has value too. My workload has value too. You don't get first dibs on everything just because you've had a child. I mean, it's very difficult. Even standing here and saying this, I'm finding it quite difficult because I can hear the pushback already. That's just mean. She's just bitter. Do you know what I mean? She wouldn't do that, you know, if she'd had children. But I'm not anti-working mums. Do you know what I mean? I wanted to be one. What I'm against is privilege and prejudice. That's what I'm against. I'm not against working mothers at all. So what? You know, I mean, I saw an interview recently with someone who said, you know, with everything that's going on in the world today, really? Is this important? And I think the so what is that fighting back against pronatalism in the workplace, number one, it's something we can do together as childless and child-free women. It affects us both. So it will bring us together in a way that will get us noticed. We will become the minority that finds its voice. And I take great strength in the journey that the LGBT movement has made in my lifetime. I mean, when I was growing up, there was a TV sitcom in Britain, and it's like there were 2 joke characters in this TV sitcom. And one was a gay guy, and one I now recognize as what you would call a crazy cat lady. It was a single middle-aged woman who talked about her pussy all the time, and that was kind of the major joke, that she was always talking about her pussy. I mean, it was, and yeah, in my lifetime, you know, it has become completely unacceptable to make a man who is gay a figure of fun just because of his sexuality. You know, that has completely changed. However, it's still okay to make a woman a crazy cat lady. You know, and actually, for me, when people say to me, you know, I think you're becoming a crazy cat lady, I'd be like, I think I need more cats. You know, it's because I'm not ashamed of my childlessness, so anyone who tries to shame me is not going to get anywhere. I'm going to get it in the neck for this, you know, for this talk, no doubt about it. You know, I know it's being filmed, so I can't pretend I haven't said these things, because, you know, when you speak out against pronatalism, it does get a big response. But as I've said, I've got nothing against working mums. I'm against privilege. I'm against prejudice. And I think, you know, we can create a fairer world, actually, for everyone in the workplace by pushing back against this, because these are issues that affect a lot of people. And I'm going to close, rather perhaps uncharacteristically, with a quote from Gandhi, you know, who's, you know, he's a bit of a, he changed a few things in his time too. You weren't the first colony we lost. No, you were the first colony we lost. We've lost a lot of them. But he said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And I think we're no longer being ignored. Thank you, Karen. Together, we can deal with being figures of fun to some people. Together, we will support each other to fight our corner. And together, childless and child-free, we're going to win. Thank you.
Use the podium and we'll do this question. Questions?
Hi, Jody. I'm Tess Singerly from Columbus, Ohio. Thank you for your talk. I identify as child-free by choice, but I have, you know, great compassion for women who are by chance and by circumstance. What would you suggest is the best way to to talk with women who are childless, to show them our support, because you know, I agree with you 100%. We're all in this together, and I want to be supportive. And
Thank you. I think it's a great question. Thank you. I think it's about perhaps being curious and open-minded to their experience. There is, you know, very little awareness in society generally that in order to get to where I am, you've got to go through grief. And we're a very grief-phobic society, so it does make sometimes for quite uncomfortable conversations. But I think just that, those open-ended questions, those empathy, just like, you know, how is it for you? You know, just instead of imagining that you know, just how is it for you? You know, how are you feeling today? Is this okay for you? Because the chances are that just knowing that you're not judging, because we, as you know, as childless women, we do get judged a lot, as child-free women do as well. So we're often on our guard. You know, when a woman comes towards us, there's part of her that goes, oh, okay. You know, because many of us have lost that feeling of safety in a group of women. You know, so it's just about, I guess, just being gentle and being curious. Thank you.
Hi, Jody. Thanks for being here. I feel like we've kind of had similar paths. I spent 12 years trying to get pregnant and didn't, and have come out the other side and figured out a new path for myself. And I think that I love your story. I think that storytelling is really important. And I feel like one of the things I wanted to challenge everyone to go back home with is, you know, I feel like a lot of people came here, and I've heard some people say that they feel really ashamed to talk about being child-free or childless, and sharing your story of infertility is really hard. And I've said to some people as I've been here that I'll be somewhere and I'll stand up and I'll say like, oh, I'm infertile, and then people come up to me afterwards and they're like, oh my God, that was such a brave thing to say. And I think that one of the things that we can all take away from the abortion rights community is that the abortion rights community has become really brave lately in sharing their stories and storytelling and the power of that. So I would encourage all of you to go home and start talking about your stories and about why you've decided to be child-free, or your struggle with infertility, even when it's hard, because that is how we gain empathy from other people and how we build community. And if you can go home and meet one or two other people in your community who are also childless or child-free, that's how we're going to expand this movement. That's how we're going to build the NotMom. But I would also just, you know, ask like how you have found things changing for you over the last couple of years, how women have, if you have seen a difference in the way that women are responding to each other, if they're changing the way that they are building community for themselves in their own hometowns or in their own home communities.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I mean, Gateway Women has more than 100 free meetups around the world. We've got one starting in India and Singapore now as well. So we're in South Africa, we're across Europe, the UK, America, Canada. And it is really interesting that it is still a huge deal to come along to your first meetup. You know, those projections I was talking about, that the other women are all going to be kind of weeping weirdos. I mean, I hear a lot of stories of women who kind of, they drive past the meetup. They just want to have a look at what these women are going to be like before they even dare to go inside, just in case they've kind of got two heads. It's really extraordinary. I haven't seen, as yet, a huge shift in the way childless women feel about themselves when they first encounter other childless women. However, what happens every single time is a huge sigh of relief and a sense of sisterhood and connection. And that, you know, meeting other childless women was a huge part of my recovery from childlessness, which is why I've put so much effort into creating workshops and meetups around the world so that other women can have that experience. Because when you see yourself reflected back to you in a culture where we are completely absent from TV, from radio, from films, from novels, apart from really, really horrible depictions, it just opens your heart to be amongst women like you. It is so important. And what you said about, you know, sharing your story in your local community, that can be hard, you know, because I think a lot of us have given up sharing our story, because we've been bingoed so many times, particularly with why don't you just adopt? Or have you heard about this fertility treatment? Or, you know, kids are terrible, or why don't you borrow one of mine? Or whatever they are, there's this kind of standard litany. After a while, you just kind of give up. I mean, I spoke to Brene Brown about it, and I asked her why, you know, why it's so hard to talk about this, why people won't let us talk about it when we raise the topic. And she said that in her research, she had discovered that infertility and childlessness is the #1 area of human empathy failure. Yeah. Yeah. By your sister-in-law, yeah. Well, some people also hear that from their therapists. Do you know what I mean? Which is really shocking. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jill from Cleveland. I just wanted to comment on your 5 things about the workplace. And I could go up there and say an hour about that topic. Yeah. So I made a list, and I always felt like commenting about women in the workplace who had children, I always felt like a betrayer of my own gender because I would complain about it. I just have a few I'd like to mention that actually happened to me. There are women I worked with who breastfed at work, and I feel like a betrayer of my gender for complaining about this, but women would take morning and afternoon breaks, a big 15-minute, I don't know anything about breastfeeding because I don't have children, but this would be like 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the afternoon, and then they would, again, who's picking up the slack of their work while they're doing this? Bringing children to work as they run around and trying to concentrate where their children are running around at work. Leaving early for sick children when their children are at home for snow days, holidays, ball games, daycare, etc. Working from home privileges. And my last boss was envious of me, probably because I had no children and I have a super awesome lifestyle. So I just wanted to say, I always felt like I was betraying my own gender for having these terrible feelings, but I'm so glad that you got up there and said this so I don't feel so guilty for having these feelings.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think to your point, it's interesting because if those things were happening for any other reason other than their children outside work, people would be, you know, the company, the organization would clamp down on it. And I think what this also speaks to is that companies themselves are kind of using our reluctance to be, as you say, gender traitors, to actually get themselves organized. You know, as long as we keep picking up this slack and as long as we stop speaking, you know, we don't speak up about it, they kind of don't necessarily need to manage it better. I do think this is a structural issue within businesses. And you know what? I think it's really tough on businesses as well. I mean, you know, I used to be a business owner. I used to have an interior design business. You know, managing maternity leave, you know, when you are an employer is extremely complex. I don't want to make out that there's some kind of easy solution to this, but you know what I mean? We're not going to get to the solution and a fair solution without being able to talk about it.
Well, actually, I'm a human resource consultant, so this has been quite interesting because as a child-free person, I've never felt that I had options or even considered options. But, you know, coming to this event, it has brought to light that I'm going to start suggesting significantly different policies to my clients when it comes to being whether you have children or not, because again, we have other things that we need to take care of that may not involve children. And it's interesting because also I was the primary caregiver of my mother because my brother had kids. Yeah. You know, and whether they were 25 and 30, it was irrelevant. It was still my responsibility because I didn't have any kids. So I think it's an interesting thing that we all need to go to your HR and have those discussions. But also those of us who have the ability to make a change in a policy or suggest a policy to speak up as well. You don't have to be in HR. If you're a manager, if you're a leader in any type of in your organization, it is time to say something about everyone else, because it's always, people who have, women who have children who get, oh, you see how she has kids, and what about us who make a difference every day in the workplace or in our family lives? Mm-hmm. So thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Charlotte. I'm from Cleveland. And I just wanted to thank you for talking about the ambivalent millennial as an ambivalent millennial myself. I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about that and how the ambivalence is a taboo even within this group, maybe.
Thank you. I think it's a really hard topic to talk about because it is infused with this pronatalist dogma that becoming a mum is natural. Nature didn't design us to have birth control. It used to be that if you were having sex, you would probably get pregnant. So if you think about it, the thinking through the parenthood choice is incredibly new. We barely have the language yet to really flesh out the conversation and the questions. It's very new. So on top of it being a taboo thing to talk about, it's also literally a very hard thing to find the language to talk about. So there's a woman out in California called Ann Davidsman who runs a website and book, and it's called Motherhood, Is It For Me? And I would really recommend exploring that because I think ambivalence is a really important topic. And it's really important to push back against the idea there's something wrong with ambivalence, because as far as I'm concerned, ambivalence is compassion and intelligence in action.
Hi, that was loud. Hi, I'm Sharon, and I'm from Cleveland also. During the session yesterday, I talked about insights from HR. I'm in HR, and I firmly believe that what you did today in speaking out and talking about it is part of what's going to help us turn this around. Whenever something bad happens in the workplace, it continues unless you speak up. Yeah. So if you're harassed, if you're discriminated against in any way, the way to get it addressed is by reporting it and saying it's not okay. And I think that's part of what we need to do as well. So thank you so much for the topic.
Thank you. I think, to your point, Sharon, I think one of the difficulties is that we often don't realize that it's okay to report this, because there's this kind of undercover thing that pronatalism, where we just think, it's okay, I'm just being sensitive, or I'm just being unsisterly, or I'm a gender traitor, and we don't necessarily report it. Also, many of the people who responded to me had reported things and had severe reprisals for doing so. That privilege is lost. They'd sort of been frozen out of organizations. They'd missed out on networking opportunities because there would be kind of clubs for kind of working mums in the organization. The power of groupthink is very, we tend to work in organizations and teams, and to be the one that actually stands up and says these things is extremely difficult. And also, I've had women talk about, yes, they've taken this issue to HR, and everyone in HR is a mum. And they have been completely unheard. So it's like this is a structural issue that goes all the way through. And I think shame and fear and job insecurity and all of these things also perhaps prevent women from speaking up when they do face these injustices.
Hi, my name's Renee. I'm from St. Louis. I was at the session yesterday on HR issues that come up for child-free and childless women. And I was talking to some folks and just on the side, and one thing that people didn't realize, and I just want to make everybody aware here, that does not have nationalized health care, and you have employer-provided health care. In some companies that have what they call cafeteria plans, which is where the company gives every employee an equal amount of flex dollars to use toward deciding what their benefits are going to be, there's a non-discriminatory issue. If your company provides health care for spouses
and for families. The difference in our company, and I only know this because I'm in leadership, the difference in our company between an employee who was single and an employee who had a spouse and children, the amount of benefits that that employee with the spouse and children got was $14,000 a year more. And I just want to let everybody know that, in case you don't know that, that disparity exists. And when you're looking at total comp, $14,000 a year makes a huge difference to most people. And so not only look at the discrimination type issues that are occurring that you can see as far as hours, but look into your benefits plans. Understand those and understand how much more people with families may be getting. Find out, because when it comes time to negotiate salaries and total comp, ask for what you deserve. Ask to be equal, because when you're talking two employees that sit next to each other that do the same job, and one is essentially getting $14,000 more a year in compensation than another one, and you don't even know about it, that's a problem. So I just want to make that aware. I know, like I said, we have a number of people in here that have nationalized health care, but where you have employer-provided health care, know what your benefit structure is doing for you.
Thank you.
And that will be the questions.
Hi, my name is Giselle Palance from Canada. Actually, I will ask the question I was going to ask the panel this morning, because you're out there in the public forum and with ideas that don't please everyone, and I'm sure there are people that are bothered by it or unsettled by it. And I'm pretty sure also that you get those really, really mean comments from some people, or some nasty things, or even worse. And how do you deal with that aspect? Because I'm sure that refrains a lot of women to speak up.
So how do I deal with kind of unpleasant comments?
Mm-hmm.
I think the key for me has been that I feel like I'm speaking for us rather than me. I feel that I have my Gateway Women sisters behind me. I know that they've got my back. And actually, when a nasty comment comes up, like quite often in the comments section of an article that I'm mentioned in, there's some really vitriolic stuff about me. I actually don't need to defend myself anymore, because everyone just piles in on my behalf. So kind of they've got my back. And also because I no longer feel ashamed of anything to do with my childlessness, that kind of really emboldens me to stand up for myself. I mean, I do have to moderate every single comment on my website because of abuse. You know, the angry white man and you stupid feminists, look what you got, ha ha, suck it up. You know, they do fall into fairly kind of standard categories. I have to say, I think I'm used to them to a greater extent. I can still be hurt sometimes, but I'm quite good at licking my wounds and coming back.
Hi, whoa, that's really loud. I'm Laura from New York, and you know, it came up this morning that some people are here because they are trying to work through some kind of a grief. And I know for myself, I'm, you know, trying to work on my plan B, and you know, something that I had read in your book that I think it's a very brave thing, and I've been toying with the idea. You had mentioned something about, you know, if like a person has a miscarriage, right? Maybe you want to have some kind of a formal ceremony, some way to mark this, right? Like marking an ending, and you know, just to be kind of settled somehow. And it's just something that I've been thinking about. It really stands out to me, and I just wonder if you could address that, because it might be beneficial to some other folks here too.
Okay. Thank you. I think our culture has sadly lost so many of the rituals that were part of our culture. And kind of the only ones that seem to be left are the ones around reproduction and kind of partnership status, you know, and children's anniversaries. So we kind of don't get very many of them. I mean, rituals are really important because they are a way that human beings have always tangibly created something to mark something intangible. It's a way to help us kind of process that transition, which is, you know, why every human culture has rituals. There are some wonderful organizations. There's Spirit Babies in California, there's Saying Goodbye in the UK, that actually help women to create rituals. I mean, Saying Goodbye is extraordinary. They create services of remembrance for babies lost at any age and any stage, and that includes those not conceived that were wanted, and in cathedrals around the UK. And it is an extraordinary thing to go and kind of almost do a little memorial to that dream, that part of your life, and it is incredibly important. I'd be very happy to speak to you privately about a few more ideas as well, but thank you for the question. Spirit Babies in California and Saying Goodbye in the UK.